Hello, Xander.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about Alexander's The Doctrines of Antagonistic Action and Mechanical Advantage, and why and how it was removed from the first edition of Man's Supreme Inheritance. So, you want to talk more about that today? And specifically, you'd like to talk about what it means to the process of creating a coordination. What does he mean by this
Yeah,
strange sentence? Okay, over
yeah,
to you, Xander.
yes. It's. I think it's a central aspect of our work. Very often people don't well acknowledge that a teacher of the Alexander technique is there to help a student create a coordination. And what do we mean by creating a coordination? Most people would think that, complex action, everyday actions that involve all the self are just stored in some sort of imprinting in the brain. That our somatic cognition is in charge of delivering coordination for us, that we don't have to think. And so a conscious coordination, that's a sentence that is used several times in the first books. And what do we mean? What does this mean? So I have prepared a few examples so that you can readily understand what is it to make something conscious, because this is the first hurdle. A conscious coordination is not a coordination that you feel. There are plenty of things you won't feel at all, or you would feel absolutely wrong when you're going to perform the conscious coordination. First of all, a conscious coordination is a coordination that has been planned, that has been deliberately set up in advance, yes, so that we can anticipate what's going to happen next. This is what is conscious coordination first. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see, it all starts with this sentence: in the process of creating a coordination. So when you look at this image, you think that there is a psychological factor. And what is a psychological factor? So let's start straight away with a student, a new student. Is a teacher of the modern Alexander technique that wanted to investigate what it was to think of a coordination consciously. So I am comparing an image where we see her standing, and I compare this image with indications that have been given by Alexander in his books. Uh, Most people read books or read Alexander's books when they are teachers of the Alexander technique, but very often what is written doesn't really make an impact. Making an impact means that you start to plan your activity and you start to observe your activity through FM Alexander's lens. It's like wanting to see whether we are working in accordance with his principles or not. It's like testing us against the book. So, of course, this student is just starting with me. So, what we see is the result of a training in the Alexander technique with the hands-on, and there is no blame whatsoever. It's just an objective image. We see that the person is standing, and we compare. And so, Alexander talks about very curiously about positions. He says in the standing and walking position. It works quite well with standing. Most people think that standing is a position, but who would think that walking is a position? So it's quite interesting to see that his conception of the word positions, goes quite well with the idea of walking. So he is maintaining that it's possible to orientate, for example, the mechanism of the torso, because in walking the legs are moving, and it's possible to maintain a position of the torso when the legs are moving. That's the first thing that is very interesting. So here we have nearly the standing position of that person. Well, it was not a trick, but the person was sitting, and I just asked this teacher, please, would you continue and stand now? And the person didn't. Well, she did know she was filmed. She knew she was filmed for the purpose of the lesson, but there was nearly no clear indication on what are the means whereby for standing in the correct standing position. And so what we see is the result of a series of movements. And so the result is that the hips were held too far forward, the knees were pressed too far back, and then the angle of the torso from the hips was armfully inclined backwards, with a general tendency, as we say, to narrow the back. I want to explain the last sentence because I think that sentence, despite the fact that it doesn't seem to correspond, because we see that the person is still inclined forward with the torso, I think it corresponds, especially if you look at the upper torso. You will see that in the process of creating that coordination, that person, well, it was a subconscious somatic coordination according to her embodied cognition and according to her, some people would say reflexes. I don't think any reflexes were active there. But this person has a tendency to throw the middle torso forward in order to go up to the standing position, and well, she compensates that extreme movement of the middle torso forward by a movement of the upper torso back. We tested and we found that when she was standing, she was really unduly lifting the front part of the chest, which means that the top of the sternum was held all the time much further backward than the lower part of the sternum, which is the top of the middle torso for me. So the angle of the top of the middle torso from the hips is armfully inclined backward. And so when we discuss the process of creating a coordination, here she created a subconscious coordination. I'm not saying that she was aware that she was sending the middle torso forward, that she was retracting the upper chest backward, and that created, of course, a shortening of the back. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the first idea, when you want to understand the sentence in the process of creating a coordination, you have to understand that we are dealing with a coordination of movements, and that this coordination of movements is a coordination of movements of body parts. And so I'm going to show you exactly what happens during the lesson. Well, it was the next lesson, not the lesson when these images were seen, but I started to discuss with the subject, with this teacher, what I could see when she was going to stand in her habitual manner. And so we see the first image here. And well, you will see it's a bit repetitive, but I've put on the right side the result of the action of going from sitting to standing. So we have the first image on the left, and you will see that image is going to evolve, and we will get to that last image, which is the moment when she's standing with the hips too far forward and the abdomen protruded, the upper torso, well, of course, unduly lifted, and the back arched. So this is the first image, and then we go on to the next, and so we can see what is happening between the first and the second. Between the first and the second, we see that the tendency in sitting to have the upper chest unduly lifted, the top of the sternum very far back, relatively to the middle torso, well, is just maintained. It's as if for the moment she is maintaining the coordination of the movement that has created the position of the torso, the position of the upper chest relatively to the upper chest, of the upper chest relatively to the middle torso, is always the same here. And so we can start analyzing all these images and look at them and look at what happens. And what I really pointed to on this lesson was the fact that if you come back to the start and look at the position of the knees, Because when Alexander is speaking about the position of the parts, or you will see he talks about the relative positions of the parts, you never know exactly relatively to what. Is saying that the knees or hips are too far forward in the resulting picture. Yes? And so we see that when the person is going to lean forward, well, she's leaning forward with an acceleration of the middle torso spot. We'll say we can measure the position of the lower sternum on image 1, and on image 2, and on image 3, and we can also notice that the lower sternum is going faster forward than the top of the sternum. This is obvious. But also, when you look at it closely, well, the images are releasing this data is that the person is sending the knees forward. When she's leaning forward, she is doing a movement of the knees forward. Of course, that movement may not be conscious, may not be really deliberate. It may be possible that the person doesn't know that she is moving the knees forward in going to lean forward. That's quite interesting. And when we continue, and we are very, very interested, Alexander was very interested at the moment of liftoff, when the person is going to rise from the chair. Well, we see here that the movement is such that the person will continue to move the knees forward and move the middle torso forward, you will see, in order to lift off from the chair. So the person is going forward with the middle torso and with the knees, yes? So we have, at the moment of liftoff, it's very clear, the lower part of the knee is going forward, as I have indicated, with a spot on the top of the bone that is on the side, the top of the fibula bone. And we see that the middle torso is going forward, while the person, of course, is retracting the upper torso back. When you retract the upper torso, you must understand that you also retract the thoracic spine. As a result, the cervical spine is, of course, directed backward. And so some people would say that she's pulling her head back. Well, in fact, you have to understand that to pull the head back in such a way, it's necessary to use the cervical and the thoracic spine. So the retraction of the head is more a consequence of our way of coordinating the movement of the parts of the torso in leaning forward. As a result, of course, of this protruding lower rib cage, protruding abdomen, we see that, of course, well, she's arching her back. She's arching her back and shortening the neck, which is a surprise, because when you imagine that the person has been trained for 3 years to use her hands in order to direct the movements of the parts of the pupil, and in order to have achieved that, it was supposed that she was able to direct her own movements. Well, we see that no, in the process of standing, of changing from the sitting position to the standing position, we see that she's not directing the means whereby movements that lead to lengthening the back, lengthening and widening the back. So we have here a very interesting starting point for a lesson. Is it possible to consciously guide and consciously control these movements? So the conscious control of the movements is here on screen. It's what we see. We see the person, in fact, deciding to respond to an instruction. The instruction was, please, could you stand up? And so the person is responding to the gross, the crudely shapen instruction. There is only one instruction, please stand. And the person is moving the knees, is moving the thigh, is moving the iliac, the lower part of the torso, the middle part of the torso, the upper part of the torso, and the neck and head. All these movements are a consequence of a response to that instruction. So when we continue, we see that the knees still are moving forward at the moment she's going off the chair. And so this is continuing all along. It's very interesting to see that the direction of the knees is not taken care of. And when she's standing, we see that we arrive at the original position here, which is the standing position. The standing position is a consequence of the process of going from sit to stand. There is no standing position as such. The standing position is a result. It's not, very often we tend to think that the position is the start, and from the position we enter into movement. Well, these images are clearly showing that it's absolutely the opposite, that the position we assume is the result of the coordination of the movements of the different parts. This is the basis of the means whereby principle. It's also the basis of the doctrine of antagonistic actions. It's through the antagonistic actions, or absence of antagonistic action between the parts, that the position is assumed. So we have now a better starting point to understand what Alexander is saying here. He is not discussing position. If you are talking about standing and walking positions, it's not the position in opposition to movements. It's in position as results of the creation, of the coordination of movement of the bony parts. That is very important, and this is why when I'm accused to deal with positioning people, I just dismiss that comment, because I don't consider that positions are starting points. I consider that positions are ends, very clearly. So we have a clear differentiation between means and ends. Now, we have means, which are coordinated movements of parts, and we have ends, position. This may seem simple, but I had to work many years in order to start to have a clear understanding about what is this discussion that is coming on and on in Alexander's books about means and ends. Now we have a very clear idea of means and ends. And these ideas are going to help us discuss other ideas, other parts of the books. So, for example, Alexander says, when inclining the body forward, there must be no bending of the spine or neck from the hips upwards. The relative positions of all parts of the torso must remain unchanged. And I want to insist on that sentence, because there are unsaid ideas. There are things that may escape a fast reading. So, first of all, of course, we have always with Alexander this idea of inclining the body. So when you see that the person is sitting, and this text comes from a passage where he's discussing inclining the body in sitting and standing. But in sitting, we have here an example of what Alexander, maintained should be changed. When you see a person going to stand and shortening the spine, arching the torso, protruding the abdomen, tightening the neck, of course, you think that they are incorrect movements that are coordinated. So the process of creating the coordination is subconscious. The person doesn't really plan to perform all these movements. The person has no very clear description of what she's doing when she's going from sitting to standing. She cannot narrate what she wants. She has no idea that she's moving the knees forward in space at that moment, and she has no idea that she could direct the movement of the knee any differently. For her, the movement of the knee is just a consequence of her going to stand. She's been manipulated by touch teachers, somatic teachers for 3 years and more, and still, after all these years, she's still, in fact, improperly using the knees, the hips, and the torso. So it's quite interesting that that comes also from the lack of accuracy, the lack of description that Alexander is giving. Because here, when he says from the hips upwards, the relative position of all the part of the torso must remain unchanged. Most people would just see position. The position of the parts must remain unchanged. Well, of course, the person is moving in space, so the position of the parts in space is changing. And how fast they are changing relatively to one another is the problem, is the matter here. So what does he mean by relative position? So there is the relative position of the parts between themselves, but also, as you've seen on all these images, I take, there is always the same line and the same bar. In fact, the bar and the lines are tools that I use in order for each picture to set where is the front of the ankle relative to an object, relative to a guideline that is outside of the person. So for example, in these pictures, I take the border of the image, I take always the same snapshot, always in the same position during the video. Remember that we are looking at images taken from a video recording of a lesson. So we have a film, and when from this film I can extract pictures. And what I want to know is how are the parts moving relatively to a fixed line. So this fixed line has to be established. So first of all, of course, I establish the fixed line relatively to the ankle. Alexander has a famous sentence in Man's Supreme Inheritance. He says that it all starts at the ankle. And well, of course, all these movements start at the ankle in the sense that what we are looking at is like an inverted pendulum, and the point of rotation relatively to the static floor is, of course, for us simply the ankle. The person is rotating the lower leg around the ankle and the foot stays in place. Well, this is not exactly what will happen, because very often, as the foot is a complex mechanism, there can be torsion, there can be, well, squashing and collapse of the arches of the foot, but more or less from at the stage where this student is, it's just necessary to say, well, relatively to the ankle, it's clear that from sitting to the moment of lift up, and even after that, the inferior part of the knee is directed, the movement of the inferior part of the knee is directed forward. Is that what we want or not? Well, we will see that if we want to maintain a relative position of the parts, it's going to be necessary to organize the movements of the part, and especially organize the speed of the movement. On this picture, we see that the speed of the middle torso is faster than the speed of the upper torso. It could be possible to imagine a different idea where the upper torso is faster going forward than the middle torso. Why not? Well, the answer will come through experiments. I will ask the person to start to work with that idea of having a part moving faster forward than the other, and find every sort of procedures where the person can effectively observe that she has an authority on these matters. She can change how she leans forward. She can change the relative speed of the different parts. And in order to make that, well, visible, controllable, and understandable, it's very often necessary to compare relatively to a fixed external guideline. And in that case, we can say that at the moment of reaching forward, when the middle torso was on the line, it was clear that the upper torso was behind it. And if we wanted to be faster with the upper torso, it would be quite simple to ask the person to, in fact, create the leaning forward in such a way that when filmed, the upper spot will be not backward, but forward of the middle torso. And in that way, the person could, in fact, realize what it is to direct movements and to direct the speed of movements. So now let's take also this sentence with a pinch of salt, because when inclining the body forward, there must be no bending of the spine or neck. Well, let's imagine that we have a situation where a person is standing with a spine that is already bent. Yes, that the person has a tendency, as we see, to have the lower sacrum, the lower part of the sacrum at the back, that is which movement is directed too far back. The movement should be directed forward. We see that because the lower sacrum is very far back, we see that the rib cage is sagging, is falling forward at the front, and that the person is not as tall as he could be. So, when inclining the body forward, there must be no bending of the spine. Well, in that case, I'm afraid to say that this sentence is inaccurate. You can bend an object, and if you want to unbend the same object, you have to do an opposite bending. In order to bend a line like this, you have to act on 3 different levels with 3 different movements. You must have one movement backward at the inferior extremity, one movement backward at the superior extremity, and one movement forward at the center. In that way, you can create a coordination that will look like abdomen protruding and shortening and narrowing of the back. It's possible. So, well, when you incline the torso, we all know in the modern Alexander technique, we have a position that is called the position of mechanical advantage, and we are asked when we train to use a position of mechanical advantage that is a flexion, which is working with inclining the body forward. When you incline the body forward, you are, well, it's a good idea to understand that we start from a wrong habitual coordination. We don't feel it, but we can use then a series of movements to bend the spine in the opposite direction. As you will see, I have a series of images. Look, between these 3 images, it's obvious that in bending and inclining the body forward, this student is lengthening the back. For me, it's absolutely obvious when you compare. You see that by accelerating the upper torso much faster than the middle torso, or in other words, in making the middle torso move in opposite direction to the upper torso, yes, going forward is a positive speed forward. You can easily imagine negative speed, that when the upper torso is going forward fast, you can have the idea, look at this, when the upper torso is going forward fast, the person is in fact directing the movement of the middle torso backward. But in this case, you can see also that is, well, applied a plan where the lower extremity, the lower sacrum, was directed forward. There is no more this arching of the lower spine. So from there, we can see that it's possible to organize a bending of the spine when inclining the body forward in such a way as to obtain a situation in which you have perfect control of course, the position of the parts at every moment of the gesture. So when we see the person going, well, from standing to sitting, you see it's a very curious procedure where the person is standing very close to a wall and is being asked to lift the hands. This is part of the procedure, and to touch the hands at the height of the face, as you can see, and to maintain this orientation, so that this is a way to examine the idea of lengthening the back by having opposite movements, and particularly an inclining of the body, yes, that is going back with the back. As you can see, the wall is preventing the person from sending the middle torso forward, while there is a risk of bumping the head into the wall. Of course, the hands are there to prevent this, but the hands are also there to help the person remind himself that he wants the middle torso to decelerate, and even more to be direct, which movement can be directed backward. And so from there, a position we call monkey, now it's possible to maintain the relative position of all the parts of the torso in going to sit. You see, the relative position of the torso is maintained. Some of my students will object, of course. It's absolutely clear that this is the start of the going down movement, is in order to sit, or in order to go into a squat. And we see that on here, the second image, we see that the student is losing touch with the head, which tends to show that at the moment where he released the knees forward, he reacted by having the upper torso, the upper spine, the spine at the top of the rib cage, was going back, pulling the neck spine, the cervical spine, and the head back. Yes? Well, yes, this is something that is corrected later, but during the lesson we are going to observe this moment, and we are going to discuss the coordination of the part. Why is it that when the knees are released forward, there is suddenly this reaction movement of the upper torso going back? This is the meat we feed on. This is how we look at coordinated movements, and this is where we can, well, consciously control whether the person during the procedure, yes, during the procedure, remember that this is in fact done in less than 2 seconds. The person has to organize the movements in his mind and work from memory alone. What he feels when he's doing the gesture is not relevant, it's too slow. Yes, all these movements have to be anticipated. We are using the principle of prevention. That is, the mental part is taking the lead in these movements. And the physical part, the feelings, are just a byproduct that is coming much later. So, it is important to note here that the imperfectly coordinated person tends to shorten the stature and pull the head back in making these movements forward, unless, therefore, the pupil remembers this subconscious tendency to shorten and attends to the new directive orders, which will counteract this subconscious tendency. His old habit will prove too strong for him. And at the first touch from the teacher to bring his body forward, though his touch may be so light that it will not move an inch thick pine board on the same length and width as the torso of the pupil, the latter will start to move forward at a ratio of, say, 75% subconscious response to his old habit, and only 25% conscious response to the new directive and guiding orders. the next sentence, Alexander is going to, in fact, change and consider that 75% is not 75% subconscious response is not a sufficiently high number to, in fact, represent what most imperfectly coordinated person tends to do when leaning forward. Here we are in the constructive conscious control of the individual. It's the part where he explains hands the back of a chair from sitting, not from standing, from sitting. So there is a subconscious tendency to trust to feeling, to lean forward. You will trust to feeling even more if you had a very long, protracted somatic training where you've been led to believe that because you were directed by someone else that has a somatic power to know what is right, you are going to trust to your somatic feeling. And unless you see yourself on a video recording, unless you are seeing that image by images, there are unwanted movements that are seen, well, you are going to trust to your feelings and think that you are properly, a perfectly coordinated Alexander teacher or Alexander student. Videos for that are invaluable. You can't imagine how much you can be helped to see what it is you're really doing. And to see when the movements, the speeds of the movements on video recording is a fantastic help, because suddenly you realize what we mean by conscious control. The conscious control of movements can only be done through such media as video, for example, or photographs, when you have the possibility to, in fact, create, well, intermediate levels in the movements, exactly as Alexander defined that we could go from standing to the monkey position and from the monkey position to the standing position. This control can be really useful. Instead of just going to stand, it's possible to imagine phases, and it's possible to start to imagine what should be the direction of the movements of the different parts in order to obtain the different levels. I'm going to give you an example so that you can see what is meant. So Alexander explains that it's possible to stop the desire to stand. What do I mean by desire to stand? Well, you have to come back to this idea that why is it that the first student was sending the body forward and sending the knees forward in order to make the standing? Yes, all this system going forward and forward and forward and forward. In fact, the person has this subconscious idea that it's necessary to use the speed of the torso momentum going forward in order to, in fact, bring the weight off the chair. The person has a conception of the gesture of going from sit to stand that requires a movement forward and a certain speed in order to, in fact, propel the body forward. Alexander says throw the middle torso forward. And so there is this idea that he could let the whole body come forward. Again, the body is here not the whole body as we consider it, but just the torso and, of course, upper limbs, which is arms and neck. But he says, let the whole body come forward until the center of gravity falls over the feet. That is to say, until the poise is such that if the chair were removed at this point, you would be left balanced in a position of a person performing the frog dance. Then, by the exercise of the muscles of the legs and back, straighten the legs and the hips, knees and ankle until the erect position is perfectly attained. So this is indicating that going back and lengthening by going back is more than just a saying, that it represents a level, it represents a step. But how to convince my student that yes, this is possible. It's possible to completely change the habitual coordination and the desire to accelerate the middle torso forward. Alexander say stop. Say lean forward. Control the leaning forward. You can see that this student is already capable of controlling the leaning forward because he's controlling the leaning, the speed of the movement of the upper torso is really calculated relatively to the speed of the middle torso going forward, such that when he's leaning forward, he's really lengthening the back from the lower sacrum right up to the 7th thoracic, and from the 7th thoracic is really going forward and up. This is absolutely obvious. Just let me explain that this is a procedure that we are using in long distance lesson. In fact, the gentleman is using an elastic band. That elastic band is set behind his shoulder blades, passing over the exterior of the upper arm, and is at that right moment is really stretching that band, is really creating a pull forward, and this pull forward has a tendency to remind him that he wants to move the upper torso forward, yes, and he must resist to that pull forward with an antagonistic movement backward with the middle torso and the lower torso. The result you see, the position of the torso in going to stand that you see, is in fact the result of a coordination of antagonistic movements organized, planned before, yes, and explained in language. We have instruction in language that are in fact sufficient to describe what are the movements of the parts of the torso, what are their speed, and the antagonistic coordination that we want to perform. So what happens is that the person is in fact in a position where if the chair was really pulled back, the person would be left in fact in a position of a person performing an equilibrium stance, an equilibrium squat if you want. Yes, so it's very important to obtain that, and it's so important that it was also necessary to make it visible. Even when the student is capable after a few lessons, to stand from a still position, it's as if this does not register in his mind. In his mind, there is something that he's not even sure is not going forward. So it was necessary to create a procedure. Exactly from there, look at the second image. The person is going backward. Can you see it? The person is requested to go back. So it's a very slight movement. So I really want the person that are listening to look at this. The person is really going back in space, yes, relatively to the wall, relatively to the vertical line of the front of the ankle. Look, the person is going back in space, and the person will continue to go back in space. So look at the movement accelerated. The person is really going to stand by going back. We don't want the person to stand by going forward with the middle torso. The whole extension, in fact, follows what Alexander was saying. Alexander said you have to extend the hips, knees, and ankle. I have changed the sentence very, very slightly, because what the gentleman is performing, the plan is performing, the plan to organize the movement, look, is extending, in fact, the knee and ankle first, the ankle and knee first. Is extending the knee and ankle. And look, the extension at the hip is staying rather the same right up to the moment where he is in fact gone back into the monkey position that I call the new monkey, because it's a monkey position in which there is an extension of the ankle. Instead of the somatic idea of bending the knee, when people bend the knee, they don't realize that when you observe and consciously control their movement, they are bending the hips, knees, and ankle. Well, Alexander, when he talks about going into this position of mechanical advantage that you call monkey, I was surprised to see that he was talking about bending the knee and hips. When going upward, you have to extend the hip, knee, and ankle. But when going into monkey, he said, he wrote just, well, bend the knee and hip. Is it possible to bend the knee and hip and not the ankle? Yes, it is. It is what this gentleman is demonstrating. He is creating a conscious control through a gesture. The conscious control is that from the sitting position, still, no movement. Of course, there cannot be an acceleration forward to stand, because as you will see, the person is going back to stand. Look, it's really clear. You want to see this. The person is going back with the back to stand. There is no possibility of accelerating a movement forward, maintaining that momentum, and then going back. It's obvious that it's impossible. I created this procedure to make absolutely certain that we could match the instruction, match the order, the new order of movement, move the back, with a real performance. We wanted to see whether it was possible to stand with the back going back, with, of course, to have the back go back, you must understand, if you look at the knees, look where the knees are on the first image, and you will find that on the second image, the knees are moving back, moving back, moving back, moving back. The knees are extending, the ankle is extending at every picture. If you remember the first student, the student that has no understanding of this coordination of the movement at the beginning of the lesson, what we would see is exactly the opposite. The pupil had the desire to stand that was associated with a movement forward and with a flexion at the knee and ankle. We want to change this coordination of the movement, and what this gentleman, this student, is showing is that yes, it's within our power, it's within our intellectual power to understand the composition of the coordination. So it's possible, it's within our power, within our authority as individuals to command this. And of course, as you can see, it's a long distance lesson. Nobody is guiding the student with hands, with touch, with feelings. The student is in charge. The student is the center of the lesson. Well, not the students really, the capacity of the students to use conscious guidance, that is, to use verbal instruction, to use a story in order to create a new coordination. To finish, I've prepared another set of lessons. I want to show where this can lead. I've taken another student that doesn't mind being shown. It's Isaac. And what Isaac is doing here is quite interesting. He's in the same situation. He's sitting very, very close to a wall, with his knees nearly touching the wall, as you can see. And I requested him to, in fact, direct some movement with the lower sacrum, hence the left hand, and to direct a movement with lumbar 3, which is the middle of the lumbar curve, the lower part of the middle torso. That is the purpose of his right hand being there. He's touching his body, but he's more interested in fact, commanding movements. He wants to see whether it's possible for him to change his habitual movements of the parts in a procedure. So, in this image, you will understand there can be no momentum forward. He's too close to the wall. If he goes forward with the middle torso, we are going to see it. And so we are starting to discuss together, Isaac and myself, in this lesson, we discuss what we call the proportion of movements. I mentioned this proportion of movement earlier because it's a big Delsart idea. The proportion of movement that the mind can impress upon the body. That's what Delsart wrote in 1853, I think. I will find the exact time. What we see is that there are two spots that are indicated on the lower part of the knee and the upper part of the knee. There is one, it's the inferior exterior part of the knee. It's roughly where you can feel the top of the fibula bone. The fibula bone is quite interesting. It's what makes the external part of the ankle. Yes, and it's a very strong attachment for the fascia of the legs. So it's quite interesting to ask a person to start directing the back. And the idea is to explore something that Alexander has just brushed upon. It's what we call shear forces, or friction forces, if you want. It's possible to ask the person to direct a movement of the inferior part of the knee, and the person says, yes, directing the movement of the inferior part of the knee, I don't really see what it means. Well, at first, to start with that, it's possible to create a physical effect so that the person will understand what we mean. So in order to create a physical effect, I ask the person to imagine, it's a story I'm telling, and I'm asking the person to imagine that it's possible to direct the whole lower leg forward. Yes, there are muscles inside the legs and strong fascias that are connected with the back, so that when the back is moving forward, it's possible to imagine that these fascias are pulling. And that way, the feet movement can be directed. It's possible to imagine that I want to push myself back into the chair. As soon as I want to push myself back into the chair and I want to slide back on the top of the seat, I can imagine just directing and having my feet slide forward. As there is friction between the sole of the foot and the floor, the feet are not going to start moving straight away. I am starting to find that the extensors muscle that extend the ankle and extend the knee, there are muscles to extend the ankle and extend the knee, and these muscles are going to act. But you won't see much. You won't see the foot move forward in space. Well, you will see that, of course, the heels are off the floor on this image, and you will find that when the person starts pushing, see the movement? It's quite obvious. The person is using a direction of the lower knee and the feet going forward, and this creates a movement backward that is absolutely obvious at the superior part of the knee. Look again, sequence. This is the moment. The person is going back and continuing to go back, and as you see, he's going back, and there is something that is happening. Is not opposing the movement sufficiently with the lower sacrum. The lower sacrum has a tendency at that stage to be pushed backward. Look at this. So we see clearly that the person is going back. It's going to lift off the chair, going back. yes, but as the lower sacrum is not sufficiently directed forward, hence the left hand, yes, what happens is that there is a very slight movement of lumbar 3 too far forward. The person is slightly arching the back. Yes, so we want to note these unwanted movements, and we want to start to in fact realize that this unwanted movement is not a decision from the part of the gentleman. This movement is the result of a wrong coordination of other movements. It's impossible to just say, I'm not going to send the middle torso forward, as it is seen here. Of course, they are missing forces, there are missing movements, and it's going to be necessary to correct this activity. There is too much movement backward of the lower sacrum again, but then we can see that it's possible to manipulate the speed of the different movements. So it's obviously visible that the superior part of the knee is going back faster than the inferior part of the knee is going forward. The position of the knee in space is the result of this proportion of movement. Every single movement, as you see, there is a change, and we obtain a standing position, yes, from the whole sequence. So let's start at the first one, and you will see in quick succession, I will arrive. That's it. In quick succession, what happens in 2 seconds, and what we want the person to change, because this is just so. Just I wanted to show the stages. The stages are: the person is sitting on the chair, and the person is going to understand that the process of standing with the frog dance game or the frog dance experiment is to first go from sitting to monkey. This is going from sitting to monkey. Yeah, and there are many defects that are going to be spotted, and so the pupil will be able to reflect on it and think, ah dear, yes, there is something that is quite interesting, is that in order to go into monkey from sitting, the control of the movement of the extension of the hip must be sorted, because you will see that the pupil is not touching the chair with the knee right now. It should continue to go back, but straight away there is a very marked decrease in the movement of the superior part of the knee going back, and a strong acceleration of the torso, middle torso, going back in space. It's not exactly what we would like. Not because the person is shortening the back. No, this gentleman has gone past this stage. It's just because with this way of going back or lack of movement backward of the superior part of the knee, we have a new symptom that we can observe, and the person can start to find ways to realize, and that is the last image is showing something different compared to this one. You will see that the result of going from sitting to standing is that the middle torso is very far forward. And on the next image, it can be seen that the relative position of all the parts can be, well, really observed relatively to the vertical of the ankle. This is a much better standing position than the one that was achieved. It's clear that when the hands are retracted, pulled back like this, it doesn't help. It makes it more difficult, but it doesn't matter. The idea is to observe. The idea is to narrate the movement we can see, and the idea is to start analyzing the whole gesture through the movements of different parts. What does it mean to rise, as Alexander was explaining, yes, with this exercise of the muscles of the legs and back, straighten the legs at the hips, knees, and ankle? What do we mean by that? What do we mean by an erect position perfectly attained? Well, this is what conscious guidance and control is about. This is what we mean by coordination, by creating a coordination. It's not, there is not a perfect coordination that the person must obtain. There are experiments where we start using verbal instruction, new orders, in order to guide very precise coordinations of movements that are opposite one to the other. That's it.
So it's clear from the images you showed there that coordination is coordination of movements. It's not something that you have in your brain that then you go around applying to your actions. Coordination is actions. It's made of movements.
Yes. Well, we must make a very clear distinction between automatic coordination or somatic coordination, and on the opposite, conscious coordination. Conscious coordination can only be conscious coordination of movements of parts, of bony parts. And conscious coordination is not a sort of pre-wired reflex in your brain that you should, get. Very often I have heard stories where people say, old reflexes have been, in fact, polluted by new habits of movement that you have taken in school or anywhere else, and so we want to expose the real somatic coordination, the real result of millions of years of evolution. I don't think this is the case at all. I think we learn every coordination. The subconscious coordination is learned. The person has acquired bad habits by repetition of somatic experiences. It's learned. But the conscious coordination is also a process of learning. The process of creating a coordination is a process of learning how to direct your mind to maintain different objects when you are performing something that is stimulating. I can tell you that sitting very close to a wall and being asked to stand without going forward with the middle torso is some of the greatest stimulation you can get. The desire to make the effort to stand cannot work, or you're immediately seen, spotted by the camera. So it's what you want. You want to know what's wrong. You want to know what you want to direct. And so conscious coordination is not in the brain. Conscious coordination is the result of our capacity of thinking without feeling, a capacity of describing scenes in terms of elements, in terms of movements of parts, in terms of speed, and our capacity to transform this into a performance. So conscious guidance and control is real. It's a real human potential. Now, in order to realize the potential, you need a few instructions given from afar and tools in order for you to start observing the result of your guidance.
Great. So for everyone watching the video, if you'd like a lesson of conscious guidance and control, you can find a link to Jeando underneath this video and book a lesson with him. So thank you, Jeando. We'll see you in the next video.
Thank you, Kevin.